Welcome to Part 2. In Part 1, we explored the foundational principles of remembrance. Now we enter the dream space of deeper symbolic, the myths behind memory. To step beyond the abstract into the felt dimensions of remembrance, we must turn to symbols, not just symbols drawn in ink or carved in stone, but living allegories, soul-encoded parables that whisper through myth, dream, and ritual. For what the rational mind struggles to digest, the subconscious mind drinks like wine. Symbols bypass the gatekeeper of logic and speak directly to the immortal thread in us that never forgot. Imagine a vast radiant palace, built not of stone but of light, suspended in a dimension outside of time. In this palace, infinite corridors stretch outward, each one a lifetime, a persona, an incarnation. In the center sits a mirror, not a physical one, but a mirror of consciousness. Each time a soul peers into it, it remembers. But as part of the ancient design, when a soul enters a new corridor, the mirror dims, not as punishment, but as a rite of descent. The game of incarnation demands forgetting the game, otherwise the soul cannot fully taste the illusion. It must believe it is separate to know the sweetness of reunion. In this sacred forgetting, the soul chooses to become the traveler, the orphan, the seeker, and so it steps into time, like a diver plunging into deep water, knowing that for a while it will forget the sky. But even as it forgets, the mirror remains deep within, behind the heart, pulsing softly. It never leaves, it only waits. This palace is you, not metaphorically. You are the architecture, you are the corridors, you are the mirror, you are not the traveler alone, you are the labyrinth itself. This is the secret encoded in the story of the labyrinth and the Minotaur. Most know the tale as a linear myth. Theseus entering the maze, slaying the beast, finding his way out with Ariadne's thread. But peel back the literal and the true alchemy reveals itself. The Minotaur is not a monster. It is the shadow self, the amalgam of instinct and forgotten pain, half man, half beast, confined in the depths of psyche. The labyrinth is the inner world, twisted and dark, built by Daedalus, the craftsman of the mind, the egoic architect. And Theseus is the soul descending to confront what it abandoned, what it disowned. Ariadne's thread, that is remembrance. That is the golden thread of gnosis, held not in the intellect, but in the intuitive knowing that guides us back to self once we dare to look the beast in the eye and say, "You too are me." Another tale, the myth of Isis and Osiris. Osiris is torn into fragments, cast into the world, dismembered by the forces of chaos. Isis, his divine counterpart, gathers his pieces, not merely to restore him, but to resurrect him as a being of higher essence. Osiris becomes more than what he was before. Here again, the myth is not merely Egyptian, it is cosmological. You are Osiris. You scattered yourself across lifetimes, across memories, across belief systems. And now, Isis, the awakened feminine within you, the gnosis of soul, is gathering your pieces. Each fragment of memory returned, each trauma integrated, each illusion dissolved, is another shard of your godhood returned to the throne. This is not poetry. This is metaphysical mechanics hidden in myth. Even the story of Lucifer, so often demonized, is another mask for the remembrance journey. The light bearer does not fall from heaven as punishment. He descends bearing the divine spark, choosing to carry the light into density. His crime is not rebellion, it is remembrance, and the refusal to forget his origin. And so, like many of us, he is misunderstood, labeled, cast out. Yet the myth, when decoded, reveals a deeper initiation. The one who walks into darkness while holding the flame becomes not lost, but illuminated from within. Each of these myths, when read from the lens of remembrance, shifts. They are not ancient fables. They are encoded maps of soul mechanics. The Garden of Eden is not a place, but a state of unified consciousness. The fall is incarnation, the descent into duality, form and forgetfulness. The serpent is not a villain, but a symbol of Kundalini, the coiled energy that when awakened leads to the return. The tree of knowledge was not forbidden because it was dangerous, but because its wisdom must be earned through experience, through the friction of choice, the fire of opposites. To remember is to re-enter the garden, not in body but in consciousness. To stand naked again, not in shame but in sovereignty. Not as Adam and Eve banished, but as the divine union restored. And perhaps the most mysterious of all allegories is this: the soul chose to forget not out of accident or punishment, but because remembrance has no meaning without forgetting. A diamond is not precious in a world of light. It is only precious because it shines in darkness. You, the diamond, plunged yourself into the soil of density so that one day you would awaken not to novelty but to essence. And when that moment came, the light you would radiate would not be borrowed but remembered. And so, across every culture, every esoteric path, the same core whispers: you were never asleep. You only believed you were. And now we turn from the mythic to the moment. From the inner temple of symbols and cosmic metaphors to the flickering light of your everyday life, where the sacred is often disguised in the ordinary, and eternity hides inside your breath. It is here, in the mundane, that the greatest challenge of remembrance unfolds. For what use is divine knowledge if it cannot pass through your words, your choices, your interactions, your silences? What does it mean in practice to live as someone who remembers? To remember who you were before time began is not to escape life, but to become radically present within it. You begin to walk the world as if it were a lucid dream, not detaching from its beauty or pain, but engaging with it from a different vantage point. You recognize each moment not as something happening to you, but through you. Even suffering begins to shimmer differently, not as punishment but as alchemical fire, refining the raw ore of your being into something incandescent. The way you speak changes. Your words begin to carry resonance, not just noise. You no longer speak merely to be heard, but to channel, sometimes unknowingly, frequencies that stir remembrance in others. A simple phrase like "you're not alone" becomes a spell of reconnection. A gaze held a little longer than expected becomes a mirror for another's soul to catch a glimpse of itself. Relationships, too, begin to evolve. You no longer seek to complete yourself in another, nor to fix or rescue them. You see others as dreamers, like you, some deep in the fog, some at the edge of waking. The pain they inflict is seen not as personal, but as the residue of their forgetting. And yet, this doesn't make you passive. It sharpens your discernment. It teaches boundaries not as defense, but as energetic clarity. You learn to honor your frequency without apology. You no longer bend your light to be accepted by the dark. You stand as a lighthouse, unmoved, and let others navigate by the beam you offer. Your relationship with time also changes. You start to feel the elasticity of moments, how sometimes a second holds the weight of a year, and other times hours evaporate like mist. You become less obsessed with future and past, not because you stop planning or remembering, but because your center of gravity shifts. You begin living in vertical time, kairos, not chronos. The sacred moment, the eternal now, becomes more real than the ticking of the clock. You realize that every now is an access point to the infinite, and you begin entering it deliberately through stillness, through presence, through the ritual of attention. Even your emotions are alchemized. Fear no longer rules as an enemy to be slain, but becomes a messenger. Anger, when honored, becomes sacred fire, the force of boundaries, protection, transformation. Grief becomes an initiation, a softening that opens deeper chambers of compassion and joy. Joy becomes less performative and more expansive, not happiness that depends on circumstance, but a soul-deep gladness, a remembrance of your unbreakable essence, even amidst chaos. You begin to remember through your body. You notice how your breath carries intelligence, how your posture affects your perception, how your cells resonate with or repel environments based on unseen energetic symphonies. The body is no longer merely a vehicle, it becomes the altar. Movement becomes ritual. Eating becomes communion. Sleep becomes astral travel. Stillness becomes transcendence. And most mysteriously of all, synchronicity becomes your new language. Patterns begin to unfold around you. Numbers, animals, symbols, dreams, not random, not coincidence, but echoes of the self calling to the self. The remembered self orchestrates these moments, like musical notes in a song you didn't know you were composing. You begin to see reality not as a stage set by fate, but as a canvas shaped by frequency, belief, and choice. Your intention becomes a brush. Your thoughts, pigments. Your actions, strokes, and what you paint is no longer a reaction to life, but a transmission from beyond it. This shift doesn't require perfection. It invites presence. You will forget. You will doubt. You will fall back into the dream. But now you know. And knowing, even for a moment, is enough to change the arc of lifetimes. You may still have a job, still pay bills, still live among those who sleep, but now you move differently. You are not merely surviving, you are midwifing remembrance into the world through your being, and that is no small task. This is the new sacred work, not to leave the world but to remember within it, to stand in the marketplace and carry the inner silence of the temple, to be both cosmic and human, rooted and infinite, flesh and starlight. Because when you truly remember, you don't become better, you become real, and reality, when touched by remembrance, bends, responds, awakens. Before we move into the final chapter of this journey, if this message stirred something ancient within you, something you couldn't quite name but deeply felt, consider subscribing to the channel. This space is not just a collection of videos. It is a sanctuary for remembrance, a temple carved into the digital ether, where soul meets signal. If these words helped you remember, even for a flicker of a second, who you truly are beyond time, leave a like. That single gesture sends ripples into the algorithm. Yes, but more than that, it affirms to yourself, I remember. And in the comments, write this: I was never asleep, I was in sacred disguise. Let that be your sigil, a marker on your path, a memory encoded in the grid. Now let us enter the final gate together. There comes a moment on the journey not marked by fireworks or fanfare, but by an exquisite stillness, where you no longer seek the light outside of yourself, because you finally remember you are the source from which light emerges. Not the light others told you to follow, not the one promised after death, but the eternal flame that was never extinguished, only hidden, veiled beneath lifetimes of forgetting. And when the veils drop, and they always do, eventually it is not a grand revelation that meets you. It is a soft knowing, a smile in the dark, a voice that says, welcome back. This is the essence of remembrance. And from that place, life itself begins to change, not because circumstances necessarily shift, but because you do. The same world looks different through remembered eyes. Trees whisper differently. Silence isn't empty. It's sacred. The space between words in a conversation becomes more revealing than the words themselves. And people, you begin to see them, not just their masks or projections, but their divine blueprint peeking through the crack. You become impossible to manipulate, not because you know more facts, but because your sense of self can no longer be hijacked. And yet, paradoxically, the more you remember, the more humble you become. Not in weakness, but in cosmic context. You no longer need to be right. You need only to be real. You don't need to prove the truth. You are the truth, embodied in walking paradox, eternal yet changing, infinite yet intimate, divine yet utterly human. And this is the quiet revolution the world is starving for. Not louder opinions or flashier awakenings, but anchored souls who remember so deeply that their very presence becomes a portal, a mirror, a lighthouse. This is the invitation. Not to escape this life, but to transfigure it. Not to seek salvation, but to remember that you are what you've been waiting for. Not someday, not after death, not in another dimension, but here, now, in this very breath. And so the call is not to become something. It is to return. Return to the frequency that sang stars into existence. Return to the knowing that cannot be taught. Return to the you who was never born, who will never die, who watches the dream and remembers the dreamer. Close your eyes now, if only for a moment. Listen. Can you hear it? That echo, that heartbeat, that knowing. It's not outside of you. It never was. It was waiting beneath every question, every ache, every mystery. You are not awakening. You are remembering. And now that you remember, what will you become in this world that forgets? Let that question guide you, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a fire to be lived. And if this fire now burns within you, never let it dim. Thank you for walking this path with me. Now remember,